everybody, Thomas here, and welcome to SFF180. And here we are for the 5K Q&A video. 5K Q&A, did I say that part? I guess I did. Kind of a tongue twister. No, not really. It's just late and I'm tired. But I'm doing this anyway. But I have to say, first off, I really apologize for this crap setup that I'm in. As you can tell, I'm in a bit of a garbage hotel room at the moment. This is the first of 2 hotel rooms. The next one will be much nicer because it will be the one in Pittsburgh. But I'm, of course, preparing to head out there for the Nebula conference. But I wanted to get this done, just, you know, to get it done, right? But, Jesus, I mean, but it explained just, I'm in this hotel room. I don't have my proper sound set up. I'm not clipped with my mic. I've just got this blaring light coming down right on my head, sending hot spots everywhere. And I'm thinking when I get home, I'm probably going to have to buy a copy of DaVinci Resolve or something to run this video through it so it doesn't look so shit. But actually, you know, image-wise, it's not so bad. This iPhone X camera is, you know, handling the ugly environment as best it can. So props there, but the rest of it, yeah. Sorry, not very good sound and, you know, but I'm just going to make do. This is all on the fly. This is unrehearsed, no script, no teleprompter, none of that. So let me go through some of these questions. First off, I want to say thank you again all these years, the last 4 years, everybody who has watched the channel and supported the channel and commented and shared the videos and just been part of this great community here that we've been building up with the SFF180 family, and it's been a blast and a real privilege to do this. And so, you know, long may it continue, right? Onward to 10K. But for now, here's some questions I got. Didn't get quite as many as I was anticipating. Maybe some of you were a bit bashful, who knows? But, or maybe, you know, email is such old technology that most of you forgot what it is. But in any event, I did get some really good ones though, and I'm gonna go ahead and answer them. Right here. So the first one comes from James Holder, a longtime viewer and subscriber. And he asks a couple of things. First thing he says, how have your reading tastes, I should, changed over your career as a reviewer? Well, boy, that's a complex question. They have changed. They've changed quite a bit. And in specific ways, I'll just try to go through a couple of them. First off, I became more determined to seek out the kinds of books that I might not ordinarily seek out if I were just, you know, reading for my own pleasure and didn't really care. I have always sort of wanted to go outside of my box a little bit, you know, which is why I would give things like in the 90s and 2000s, you know, I would give things like urban fantasy a try, and these giant doorstopper epic fantasy novels. I'd try them out, even though I knew they weren't probably quite my thing. And in many cases, I found myself liking some stuff that I would not have thought I would have liked. So trying to be more open-minded and very broad in the kinds of SFF I was reading was something that I was determined to do early on. Science fiction and fantasy is not just those two things, right? Within that general genre heading, there is so much of variety that is possible in terms of the kinds of stories that you can tell. And I've been determined to experience as much of that as I can. A lot of readers, I think, kind of want to find their comfort zones and, you know, stick with that. And that's fine if that's, you know, that's your jam. Do that. But I have wanted to be very omnivorous as a reader. In terms of tastes changing, yeah, you know, some books that I might have loved as a kid or even as a younger man, I don't like as much anymore. Some stuff that I didn't like earlier on, I'm a little bit more forgiving towards. So yeah, opinions do change. It's kind of on a case-by-case basis thing. Since I've been doing BookTube, and I've gotten to know a lot more readers and a lot more reviewers, you know, many of them quite younger than myself, and it's been interesting to sort of observe, you know, the attitudes and beliefs that they bring to their reading. You know, it's a new generation, new ways of looking at things. And I've been trying to take some lessons from some of that too. So I've been more aware of things like inclusivity in books. And so it makes me now, I can look back at classic science fiction that I might have read as a kid or as a teenager or something. And at that age, I might not have known, wow, yeah, this you know, entire book, there's not a single female character in it except for this one, you know, assistant girl who gets, you know, kidnapped by the alien or something. I would not have necessarily made a note of that. But now I would notice that. It's like, well, why do all the, you know, the heroes and the scientists have to be dudes or something like that? Now, I don't necessarily hold that those old classic SF novels are bad for being that way. That's just the result of them being a product of their time, right? And a lot of that had to do with the way science fiction was marketed back then. It's very easy to be unaware now, especially if you're like a millennial or a Generation Z reader or something. You're just kind of coming to this. You're coming into a reading environment and a publishing world that is more inclusive. I mean, in terms of the readership that it's geared towards. When I was a kid, the prevailing attitude towards science fiction was not respectful, right? Among the literary world in general. And it just, and among your peers, right? These days it's, everybody loves the MCU, SFF culture, SFF fandom, it has become mainstream popular culture. But in the earliest days, even before I was born, right, science fiction was marketed, it was assumed, and therefore directed, all the marketing was directed, and the stories were written for an audience of 12 to 15-year-old boys. That was the assumed only audience for science fiction, right? And then by the time you were a grown man, you were kind of, if you're still reading science fiction, it's like, well, okay. But you were generally expected to have outgrown it by a certain point. It was considered a literature, they were considered boy stories, the whole genre. And so to see it being this much more broadly accepted genre, with reaching out to as wide a base of readers as possible, is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. And so what that means is the kinds of stories that are being produced are different. So that's really what it was all about. I don't think it was necessarily always this raving sexism on the part of writers or something. There's quite a lot of that. But mainly it was just, this was how the genre was seen. That was the assumed audience for the genre, the target demographic, adolescent boys. And so that's why a lot of classic science fiction just looks like that. So I don't think that those stories are bad now. I just think that they were a product of that time and of that kind of marketing philosophy. I am looking now at older science fiction through the lens of, new ideas. I still appreciate most of it, but for different reasons, And I'm more able to see how the earlier stories, were very formative in, the evolutionary path of the genre, as it growing towards becoming, this much bigger and more broadly based thing. And I think it's been a very, very good thing. I can understand why younger readers might not find classic science fiction to their liking, but that would be true of a great many things, right? Somebody who's 15, 16, even 21 years old today isn't necessarily going to be all that into watching movies from the 70s or listening to, classic rock from the Doors and the Rolling Stones or anything like that, right? They've got their own thing they're doing. And same thing with books, right? Okay, and next up, leading into that, James asks, what is your take on the current state of science fiction and fantasy separately and together? Well, I think what's happening is there is a cyclic thing that goes on in terms of which of the two are more popular. It's been kind of accepted that fantasy is more commercially viable than science fiction for a lot of reasons. Unless science fiction exists in its most simple basic state, right? Like just general space operas with, of the Star Wars type. And Star Wars isn't really science fiction, it's fantasy too, right? It just happens to be in space. But so Star Wars is fantasy. This is because fantasy, I think, deals in more general archetypes that are more accessible to broad readership, whereas science fiction is kind of nerdy, right? And that's fine, I'm not saying that in a derogatory way. Science fiction tends to be a bit more idea-centric. Plots are driven by ideas, and particularly hard science fiction, the whole idea, the whole approach was you have a scientific problem, or the characters are there to solve a problem that requires scientific ingenuity. And that was kind of a template that a lot of science fiction followed. So just by the virtue of being those kinds of stories, there was less of a broad appeal, right? But I think that what's happening now is the pendulum is maybe swinging back towards SF and publishing being a bit more of a commercially viable thing. Again, we're moving back towards science fiction. If you go to Barnes & Noble or Waterstones or whatever, wherever you buy books, if you shop brick and mortar, and, you will see, go to the SFF aisles, and it's a hell of a lot more F than SF, generally. I remember when I interviewed David D. Levine, you can watch that on my channel somewhere, dig it up. He was talking about how when he was in the early drafts of Arabella of Mars, which went on to win the Norton Award for Best YA that year and all that, which is a planetary romance. It's a very old school kind of science fiction, which is it's very, very fantasy, immersed, but it's a science fictional universe. He was told flat out by quite a few people in publishing, agents, and just don't bother writing science. Science fiction does not sell. Don't even bother writing it. He was told that. But I think that's coming around a bit more. It's coming around, I think, as a result largely of, other types of media like television and film. The Expanse, which I know Sci-Fi just canceled, but those books are quite big as a result of that. I mean, there's this kind of feedback loop. Whenever a movie gets made of a science fiction novel, and we're seeing more and more of them happening, right? Lately, literary science fiction producers and production studios, they've just been snapping up rights left and right to these books. It's very much, literary science fiction is quite a hot property in Hollywood at the moment. So that is having, of course, kind of a backscatter effect on published science fiction. The movie doesn't even have to be good. My old buddy Stephen Gould, when his book Jumper was made into a film, you might remember that from a few years ago, right? Didn't really do all that well in the theaters. Wasn't probably the best movie it could have been, but it was decent enough. Did okay money, but it put the book Jumper, boom, back on the New York Times bestseller list. I think actually on the New York Times bestseller list for the first time ever. And it had come out, I think, like in 1988 or something originally. So that had a tremendous effect on his career. And now his book Impulse, which is one of the sequels to Jumper, is in development as a TV series, which is this YA science fiction television series now in development based on that. And that, of course, is going to bring more readers to his books. So that's been happening with, I think, anything that is getting snapped up by Hollywood. It's bringing more attention to written science fiction again. It's bizarre to me that we are actually living in an age when a novel like Annihilation, which when you read it, feels like the absolute antithesis of commercial science fiction, which you might think that would be, that can actually get not only optioned by Hollywood, but made into a film, actually produced into a film. Annihilation, many, many years, Annihilation strikes me as being, the way Hollywood used to work. It could have been a novel that would have been optioned, but then it would have been in development hell for like 20, 25, just never would have been made because nobody would have been willing to take a crack at a script that strange or something. I mean, that happens even to what you would think of as commercially very viable stories. Ender's Game. Orson Scott Card had been trying to turn Ender's Game into a film ever since the book came out, which was 1984 or 85, something like that. And it took so close to 30 years for an Ender's Game film to happen. Annihilation got made into a movie immediately. And that's a really just completely surreal, bizarre story. But it just it was that right synergy of the right director coming off of a previously successful movie with the clout to get that kind of thing. Studio ended up burying it because they didn't know what the fuck it was. But, so that's Hollywood being typically stupid. But the thing is, it got made. And so all of these things happening. So now you've got a BBC, I think, miniseries of The City in the City by China Miéville. So I see science fiction on the ascendant. Fantasy, I think, apart from... Fantasy seems to be actually really buzzing a lot in the indie press and self-published circles. And Mark Lawrence is a guy who is really trying to steer a lot of attention towards self-published fantasy writers. So I give him absolute props for that. very cool guy to do that, to use his pull in that way. But I do see that, the dominant commercial form now is no longer, as it would have been 20 years ago, the 900-page Robert Jordan doorstopper epic. That's just like not, that used to be like the thing you would write. If you really wanted to make money and get a big audience putting this shit out, you had to write those kinds of books. And a lot of books were written just under that philosophy. Epic fantasy is still a thing, but it's no longer like the, apex predator of the SFF racks anymore. I should have probably warned you that I ramble like a son of a gun when I do these answers, so I hope you're really settled in for the long haul on this one. Okay, back to this. Andrea. Hello, Andrea, a.k.a. Curly Books. Hi, thank you for your questions. Okay, just wants to know what my favorite SF novel of 2018 has been so far. She read Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill and loved it. Alas, he didn't have an answer for me and instead recommended 2 fantasy novels, as he thinks sci-fi and fantasy are interchangeable. No, Steve. And I do not. You are correct, Andrea, for that assumption. I'm wondering if you have an actual sci-fi recommendation for me. What's been your favorite of the year so far? Or 2018 releases so far. I'm all about Adrift. By Rob Bofford, which I just reviewed. Bing, go check it out. That's been the nicest surprise. I think that book is really going to be a big sleeper hit when it comes out in June. But there's still a lot to come. It's early days yet. And I am very, very eager for a Peter F. Hamilton novel that's happening in September. And then there's still quite a few books that are on my 2018 anticipated list that I'm still needing to tick off, but I've been caught up with all the BookTube SFF Award finalists lately. So far, this still just being mid-May as I record this, my favorite of the year has been Adrift by Rob Bofford. That's like Hitchcock's lifeboat in a little space shuttle craft. So I'll just leave it at that. Okay, but thank you, Andrea, for writing. Let's skip on up here, and we'll see. One more. Oh, this comes from Andrew Werdeman. Thank you, Andrew, for your questions. He has a 2-parter. Oh, and this is a good one. I remember getting this and saying, okay, this is real food for thought here. How do you distinguish between the art and the artist? To clarify, I recently gave away, unread, The Mists of Avalon because of the allegations against its writer. When my channel was very young and still new, and I was trying to come up with interesting video ideas, I did this big overview video of the Ender series, speaking of Orson Scott Card, the Ender series, in which I spent maybe about the first 7 or so minutes talking about the controversy surrounding Scott's politics. At the time. The reason I went into, people who are discovering the video now are like, dude, why do you just go on and on about that shit? It takes you 7 minutes. I just want to hear about the reason I was going on and on about it at the time was because at the time it was a relevant topic of conversation because Scott had been tapped to write a Superman series for DC Comics. And as a result of that, all of the, hubbub about him being a raving homophobe, which he is, he's Mormon, very traditional, very old-fashioned in that regard, came up, right? And thinking so it's not appropriate for him to, write these comics with these bigoted attitudes. So it was relevant at the time, and that's why I went into this discussion saying, I believe that a work of art ought to be judged on its artistic merits. And really good art, it's true, can be produced by dodgy people or people who have politics and attitudes and beliefs that you find unsound or questionable or what have you. People who are utterly horrible human beings can produce wonderful art. It's a thing. I can only say that you have to let your conscience be your guide on this. There's really no other way. And there's no one-size-fits-all rule for it, right? In Scott's case, for example, he has a socio-political view that I disagree with, that I consider to be bigoted. I'm not necessarily going to blackball a writer and refuse to read or review his works simply because he has what I consider to be reprehensible ideas. On the other hand, somebody like Marion Zimmer Bradley, who was a child rapist, okay, if you're talking about somebody who's done criminal shit, I thoroughly understand. Yeah, I mean, yeah, pretty much willing to say, yeah, you're an unperson for that. I mean, I don't even want to, and it's tough, right? And I imagine how tough it has been for, some of the folks. An entire generation of women were inspired to take up the pen and start trying to write for a career, try to write fantasy and science fiction through the works of women like Marion Zimmer Bradley, others as well, Anne McCaffrey, Andre Norton, folks like that. But Marion Zimmer Bradley was huge for so many people, an idol for so many people. So imagine what a blow that would have been. So imagine, pangs of conscience would have been really, really difficult there. For my part, right, I'll say this. Dodgy, shitty political beliefs, I won't necessarily blackball you. I'll rake your book over the coals, right? If your beliefs are, if informing the work, and because to me that's all part of criticism, right? And science fiction is political. There's no way science fiction can't be political. Okay, the very act of imagining a future requires a political stance, because you have to picture how that future is going to operate, right? How do people live? What choices are available to them? Are there, what kind of economy and political structure governs them? Do they govern themselves? Is it a utopia? Is it a dystopia? Is it none of the above? Is it something in between where people are just kind of getting along? Is there a class system? Is there a great wealth imbalance? Or is there some kind of wealth parity that has been achieved? Any decision you make is going to be a commentary of some sort, of a political nature, right? It can't be avoided, which is why I think it's really, really stupid when you get some of these folks who are very reactionary. Like, I don't like politics in my science fiction. I just want a great story. I want science fiction to be like it used to be in the good old days when it wasn't horse shit. It was always fucking political. Always. Always. All right? You see a space opera where the entire goddamn crew of a spaceship, is all white dudes. That's a political statement about who gets to do things like fly around on spaceships in that future, right? It's always political. Sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's subtextual. Sometimes it's something that the writer just puts in there simply because it's how they think. They're not trying to be preachy or didactic, but they just have a way of thinking of things. So that comes out in their writing. Sometimes it's like that, but it's never apolitical. And the people you hear saying like, I can't stand when, the SJWs just shove their fiction, their politics into their fiction. Well, fucking yeah. I mean, yeah, if these are the real beliefs that you have, your writing is going to reflect those things. I mean, if these are the values that you hold, you're going to use your writing to express those values. That's what the point of writing is, right? And the only reason that you think the stories that you used to enjoy from the good old days were apolitical is because you didn't notice the politics because you agreed with them. The politics lined up with your politics. So you didn't think it was that big a deal if, there was an entire planet of vegetarians or all male spaceship crews or, whatever the future was depicted in that book. Where somebody else might look at that and go, "What? This is kind of fucked up, isn't it? What do you mean? It just seems perfectly fine to me, right?" But it was never apolitical. You had just had the luxury of being able to ignore the political statement being made and enjoy it as fiction. Okay. Man, the comments for this fucking video are going to be something else, I tell you. Okay, second, what is your favorite Mass Effect style space opera series? Fun action, big ideas, epic in scale, blah, blah, blah. Wow. I don't know if it's Mass Effect-y so much, but I love the absolute go for broke insanity of whatever Peter F. Hamilton decides to put his mind to. The Night's Dawn trilogy is ridiculously over the top in every single way, but I am just so absorbed in that future. In fact, I just started rereading The Reality Dysfunction not long ago. And loved how I just immediately fell into it. There's just something about how he's just not afraid to, it's the whole go big or go home attitude, and he just does it. Peter F. Hamilton's approach with his Commonwealth novels and then the Night's Dawn trilogy. Also, yeah, you know, The Expanse, heaps of fun. And I like, again, not entirely sure how Mass Effect it is, but I like Jack Campbell and his, you know, his spacefaring military SF type of stories. So, yeah, I mean, 'cause, under the criterion of fun, action, big ideas, epic, and scale. There you are. Well, I keep going back to that question of, you know, how do you separate the art from the artist? And the whole Marion Zimmer Bradley question, because that was tough for a lot of people. Her history was already a bit sketchy because, you know, her husband had been convicted many years ago, and you know, for child molestation, and she was always kind of thought to be an enabler of that, but I think a lot of people at the time probably thought, well, you know, it's natural to kind of want to come to your husband's defense and be in denial about, right, horrible things that your spouse does and what have you. So, you know, so that's a thing, right? But then it turned out later on, many years after she died, her daughter came out and said, no, this is what my mom did to me and did to some of her little friends. Like, she was right there alongside her husband doing this shit. And awful. It's just so sad, just so sad. And in the history of SF, she's not the only pedo. I could probably tell you a story about that. I'll save that for another time. Okay, here's the last one. This comes from Omar Syed. Hello, Omar. Thank you so much. Omar's from South Africa. So, nice to know. Anyway, he says, do you feel... It's a bit of a... Well, I'm rambly too, but the general thrust of his question is that, do I tend to shy away from... I remember just recently, a few minutes ago, I was talking about those big doorstopper fantasy books. And he's essentially asking me, do books of extreme length dissuade me from reviewing them? Because, you know, he says, I find that authors like Peter F. Hamilton and Neil Stephenson can make a guy like me rich by preventing me from having to buy books more often due to the sheer size of their works. But I also admit that the commitment is sometimes too much to ask for. You did provide a review of Seven Eves, but due to not seeing a review of The Rise and Fall of Dodo, I was just wondering if this was the case. Well, first off, yeah, Dodo is one that I started and meant to finish and get the review done, and didn't for various reasons, but I did read quite a ways into it. The paperback is just out, so it's still relevant, so I'm maybe by the summer, I do finally want to go ahead and get a review up of that, because it is a significant book, and yeah, I feel like I should be covered. So I haven't abandoned plans to review Dodo. But I'll say that, yeah, I mean, books of massive size, another example would be Oathbringer, right? I mean, sometimes I look at those and, yeah, I think to myself, Christ, you know, in the time it takes me to read this 900-page tome, I can read three 300-page books by 3 other writers, and maybe I'd just rather do that, right? I have enjoyed quite a few very long books. But even in the ones that I've enjoyed, I've more often than not, I won't say always, more often than not, felt that the extreme length of the books was more of an indulgence than anything else, and in many cases, the book would have been just fine having, you know, a few hundred pages short of its length. Seven Eves, which I thought was excellent, still could have done without that entire third section in the far future. I mean, because it felt really unfinished. He should have just chopped that whole thing out and made it like the first half of its own book. But Stevenson has just turned into that guy who's like, all right, well, if I write anything ever, it's got to be 800 pages minimum, or whatever his attitude is. The fact that I was still willing to give that book such a strong review and a high rating should be taken as a testament to how damn good those first 2/3 of the book are. But, all right, and what else? Here we go. He says, do I think there should be more abridged versions of such works? Well, I guess I'd maybe just kind of answered that. I don't know about abridging the works, but just writers learning more discipline. See, here's the thing about old school science fiction, retro science fiction that I love, right? Customarily, these books can be about 200 pages. right? Many of them are the size of what Tor.com are releasing these days as novellas, right? Tor.com is releasing these 150, 160-page novellas. 150 pages used to be a science fiction novel, okay? 200 pages. And there were a lot of reasons that were informing these editorial requirements to keep books a certain length. A lot of, having to do with sales, what the the publishers at the time felt was marketable. Again, partly having to do with the assumption that the target audience for science fiction would be adolescent boys, and so they're not going to sit around and read 1,200 pages of whatever. But it was also weirdly commercial in a lot of ways. So this would have been the days before Amazon and before you could just very easily mail order books. And so let me tell you, special ordering a book, if a bookstore didn't have a book you wanted and you had to special order it from the publisher or from a different distributor or something like that, it was a grade A pain in the ass in the pre-Amazon days, or pre-internet days, I should say, because there's lots of places online to order books. Massive pain in the ass to do it that way. So yeah, that's improved the accessibility of books generally. But what that meant was you had the chain bookstores were where 99.999% of readers. Well, wrong. Okay, libraries are not figuring into my equation here. Libraries are a thing, right? But I mean, if you wanted to buy books to read, you had to do it at a chain bookstore. You could also go to a grocery store and a drugstore, which used to have perhaps bigger little book racks than they do now. But you would have to go to the chains that were the precursors of, in the States, the precursors of Borders and Barnes & Noble, which would have been Walden Books, which would have been B. Dalton Booksellers, Pickwick Books. It was a lot like the way Blockbuster back in the 90s really controlled how Hollywood marketed movies. Because it was like, well, how do we get the most rentals off of these racks? What are our customers responding to? Blockbuster would basically dictate how Hollywood made movies, generally, and it would dictate how they were, like the key art, right? Like Blockbuster always wanted the star of the movie on the video box, right? So that's how that got to be a thing. So in the same way, retail requirements dictated what kinds of books were printed. And for science fiction books, a lot of publishers, if you were doing mass market originals, which was the bulk of science fiction publishing at the time, they wanted them to be around 175, 200 pages for what would be like a mid-list title. And the reason for that was because if the books were a certain thinness, it was easier for the chain bookstores to fit them on the shelves. I mean, that was the literal reason. It was like the physical requirement of in-store rack space real estate was dictating, the artistic limitations of what you could do in writing science fiction up to a certain point. What this did, right, was it forced writers to kind of train themselves to be really efficient tail spinners, right? Like you had to get in, get the job done, get out, right? Beginning, middle, end, tell a satisfying story within a, it was taken as kind of an artistic challenge. It's like a complete satisfying story in a tight little package. And I admire that, right? I mean, I admire, the creativity involved in taking a limitation and turning it to a benefit, or turning it into something that you can just, I have to work with this, so I will work with it, and I'll make it work. And what can I say? I mean, I admire that kind of discipline. I admire a writer who can tell a disciplined story. And so I do like the fact that the Tor.com novellas, being as popular as they are taking us kind of back to that. I mean, writers are enjoying the hell out of writing these little 100, 120-page stories. They don't have to devote, just reams and reams and reams of words to storytelling anymore. What's strange is that I have since been so intrigued by some of the stories. What Omar has done is that he's having a difficult time finding things to read, so he would go to read the summaries of SF books on their Wikipedia pages. I would tend to advise against that because Wikipedia is, it's an online encyclopedia, so there's no filters, right? If they do it like Cliff's Notes, like if they're going to summarize, if there's an entry for a book and they're like plot summary, you get the whole thing, right? I mean, spoilers galore. There's a beginning, middle, end, who dies, right? Everything. So if it's not the place to go if you want to just sort of get a taster. Reviews are better for that. Reviews by reviewers who are ethical enough, not to be spoilery, and you'll find a bunch of reviewers and book bloggers, booktubers, people out there whose tastes and attitudes towards reading are those that you kind of identify with and that you find trustworthy and worth following. Maybe online review averages are our best bet to helping us choose which books to read. Yes, I would agree, Omar. I mean, like I said, find several, like-minded folks, and hopefully you have good reading adventures as a result of that. Okay, then. So that's it for the 5K Q&A. I want to thank everybody again so much, all for the past 4 years. 5,000 plus subscribers, on to 10,000, right? Let's get this going on. Took 4 years to get to 5. Maybe we can say let's take 2 to get to 10. Sound like a plan? Hey, again, thank you all so much. Now for me, it's onwards to Pittsburgh and for the Nebula Conference. So I'll by the time you watch this, by the time you're watching this, I will probably be in Pittsburgh in a much nicer room. And getting ready to vlog events for you and what have you. So thank you all so much. Again, I just can't tell you what all your support means to me, to help me, I get to do this lovely little hobby because you guys have been so supportive of it all. And to my patrons, people who go the extra mile, I want to thank them for their added support too. It's been fantastic. So that is it. And until I see you guys next time, I'm going to get in that. Why is everything in hotel rooms this odd shade of orangey brown? Why? Like who decided? I mean, were there like psychological, did they lock people in a room, like test subjects, like some creepypasta, and like subject them to, burnt orange walls, and, like the first one to go mad and, eat his own fingers would like, all right, there we go. That's the color we're going with, right? Who knows? I don't know. But I'm here, and I'm going to crash now because it's probably about midnight as I'm doing this. So until I see all of you next time, happy reading.